Jake, as you screamed before the audience got here, we are back live.
We are back! Live. Well, actually, I mean, this technically won't be live when it goes up.
No,
Because we
but
don't
we
broadcast
are
live.
back live in person like it should be for all our podcasts instead of doing it over the phone. So, audience, hopefully you can hear us very well. We are in a very bunkered area, I would call it. We're waiting for the apocalypse to take place here in the next,
Staying safe from the storm that's coming. We've got water, we've got soda, we've got, well, all the necessities.
We even have a bathroom.
We do have a bathroom. There's a little shower in there, too.
Oh, fancy.
Yeah.
Anyways, so Jake, I got a question for you to start this series off, or this segment, let me just say this. Do you prefer fan films or the actual films? What have you seen more of a better quality of lately? Let's say this past decade.
Well, it depends what genre we're talking about.
Let's go Star Wars.
Yeah, I had a feeling that was going to Star Wars. And I gotta say, unless, I mean, the only thing that pulls, so, I'm going to say this, but I'm going to have an exception to it, okay? So, fan films is doing better, in my opinion, with Star Wars, with the exception of Rogue One. And if we're going to count TV shows, The Mandalorian, because, I mean, lengthwise, it's often, I mean, fan films are usually pretty short. But as far as getting excited, yeah, I would say fan films.
Because the reason I ask you that is I think this might go into a deeper conversation. Would you say, if this is an accurate statement, do you feel like YouTube and like all these other digital platforms that us independent filmmakers and us independent artists have a shot, not only a shot, but say that we can put out just as good as quality as some of these high-end studios? And where do we see ourselves? Where do you see YouTube going? Where do you see all these streaming services going eventually down the line?
So I think there's a lot of talent on YouTube and just in general, like, fan bases, not just the Star Wars one. I want to go beyond Star Wars there and just say there's a ton of talent out there, a ton of professional talent even, and people that are just making things as fans that are, one of the things that really shows is, like, they are fans. You can sometimes tell, I think, especially with the new Star Wars movies, you kind of question how much of a Star Wars fan some of them are. But when it comes to the fans, I mean, you can tell it was just, like, made by a fan. And I think that's where, like, I mean, when a work is made with passion like that, it's, even if the quality isn't as good, like, because they didn't have as much funding, you can really see just, there's more excitement, more passion going into it. And as an audience member watching that, you also feel that excitement. You feel that passion. You feel that inspiration. And so I think that's where YouTube and other platforms similar to it provide these new creators a chance to really grow and thrive. And especially, you know, right now when movies aren't being made because of the quarantine, it's an excellent opportunity.
But you don't have to have the cinematic quality. Like, it doesn't matter what camera you use.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about the script, especially when you're younger. But at the same time, as you move up the amateur ranks and you become professional, why in the past half-decade have we seen films that don't have good scripts, yet have the cinematic, like, shine to them? Like, it's weird how it's reversed, because at the small level, at the really amateur level, the independent filmmaker level, you're trying to work on your video quality, but you're also trying to be like that great standout script, to get that great storyline down, the plot, the scheme. But somewhere along the line, as soon as you start making the big bucks, it flips.
So I think what there is there's an element of it's no longer about passion. It's about making money in the end. And they know that the bright colors, the fancy film pictures, excellent, you know, looking fight scenes. I don't want to say excellent fight scenes, but fancy looking fight scenes. You know, the bright colors. Think of, like, Rise of Skywalker, for instance, that battle scene at the end. It becomes more about drawing in attention for money rather than actually caring about the world, caring about the characters, and caring about the core stories. The priority for so many directors, especially coming out of certain franchises, it's not to tell a good story. It's something else. It kind of varies depending on the person.
Where do you think we're going to be in the next 5 years? Do you think Hollywood's going to change his approach a little bit? Do you think that there's actually blowback in the box office? Let's say coming out of quarantine here, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because you look at the streaming services. Like, a few years ago, I talked about Netflix, like, only having a 5 more year run at the top of the charts here. But then you look at what Disney Plus did. It came out. Everybody thought, oh, Disney Plus is going to be great and all high and mighty. But, you know, yes, it has that backlog of all the old films that used to draw people in, you know, our childhood, going back to it. But it lacked the new content because it was still filming it before the shutdown of the COVID crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had Netflix saying, well, guess what? We got enough content to just push through for the next 5 months that's ready to go. So where do we think we're going to end up being here? Do you think Hollywood's going to go back, or not even Hollywood, but do you think any more major films are going to go back to telling good original stories and not trying to like blow people away with the graphics?
Oh, certainly. I always think there's going to be. So you're going to see certain stories, certain movies are going to rise to the top, the cream of the crop. And so certain directors, they're not going to cave to these pressures for, money or telling telling something beyond the story that they want to tell for their plot. Telling beyond a good story. Certain directors, they're not going to give up that vision just because they're working with Hollywood. So you're always going to have some that are going to rise up. And you're also going to have some that are just going to be a huge flop. I think really the franchise that will be interesting to watch is Marvel, because Marvel has a reputation for pretty good characters and pretty good stories. I mean, some of that's kind of gotten watered down now, but especially at the beginning, it was the characters that drove them along. And now that they've stepped out and just lost some of their big names, I guess I could say spoilers, but I won't say it. But you guys, I think most of you in the audience will know what I'm talking about. Certain characters aren't there. It'll be interesting to see what they do with these other characters, because they can still do a great Phase 4. Because, the characters are interesting enough, and if they tell a good story, it's going to work. I think of Doctor Strange 1, nobody knew who he was, really. And the movie did fantastic. So, there'll be an interesting one to watch to see what direction they go. Because they could go the storytelling route, or they could go, let's just milk this franchise, something like that.
There's been in the past, and I've been doing a lot of research on this, not only with the political game going on and stuff like that, but you get these...
That's always one of the big worries.
You get these YouTube channels going off right now, okay? Like, there was just a report the other day that some of the YouTube channels I watch, and this is true factual, okay? People can look it up. If I want to drop the links, I probably will in this description below. But you have news channel, like these reporters that go out, they're reading articles to the audience, to their followings or whatever. Some of these people, and particularly the guy I watch, he got 90 million views last month, okay? Mm-hmm. When an average CNN and MSNBC had 5 times less than that for last month. So the question is, for the big game, okay, say a Hollywood industry, because we're still talking about films, say there's YouTube channels, whether it be ours in the future that decides to rival and grow up the charts, but maybe there's a Star Wars theory out there, or like somebody else putting out these quality content films that all of a sudden we don't need big studio backings. What's that war going to look like between the amateur filmmaker that's like the independent, we're putting out good quality feature and short films, versus the Hollywood studios? Because I've said this for years. Hollywood's going to need to find a way to reduce the amount of money they spend on these films. There's almost no need for half the budget that they spend for these. You looked at Invisible Man. I don't know if you watched that in theaters. It's a little bit thriller,
it's a little more towards the horror genre than I like to go. But I'm familiar enough with the concept because it did seem like an interesting one.
So they made that film for $8-9 million. Okay?
That's more than I expected.
But still, it grossed like over $100 million.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, that should show you. And like, yeah, there's not a lot of special effects, but going invisible and turning somebody invisible, they had
there's some special you have to have
effects.
In there.
The question is, do we go back to fundamental roots, especially if the economy decides to fluctuate? Do we go back to fundamental roots of guerrilla warfare when it comes down to like filmmaking, and just trying to tell a story in a basic setting and using as less of CGI and more reality?
So I think
that is a loaded question. I apologize.
Yeah, and so one thing I want to point, I'm gonna latch on to just a couple points out of there I want to pull out, and one in particular is kind of where you finished there, is pulling away from CGI and getting back to more real world. And I'm going to include real world there as also just having props, even if there's a digital effect around them. And I think we've already started to see a movement there in the past couple years. People are going away from just pure CGI, in part because for the actors themselves interacting with the world around them, when you have a prop that's the accurate, roughly accurate shape to what you're dealing with, or even a real prop, let's say you made an X-Wing. I remember for Force Awakens, they had an X-Wing prop and things like that. For when it comes to the actors, they can do so much more. It can make the movie feel so much more real when you have actual props there. And so we're already seeing that movement towards that, which I think is a fantastic movement.
Yeah, well, let me go to the green screen and like trying to narrow down a little bit of that acting about making the actors feel comfortable. We've talked with Scott Winter about that in Fight for Me
Mm-hmm.
because to do the Fight for Me thing, yeah, we had when he was training. We didn't need the green screen set up because he was just back in the gym we were shooting.
Mm-hmm.
But to set up the green screen and have them feel like it was an audience watching them, you know, they told me they're like, listen, I mean, we couldn't get the same feel from anything. It's like it would have been different if we actually had extras on set, and watching them and trying to do all that stuff. They couldn't get that feeling. So I can only imagine what it's like being an actual
Especially for some of the
mainstream actor.
advanced sci-fis,
Yes.
like where you have some pretty wild technology going. So we've done a little bit of filming with like in the sci-fi genre, and it's a lot tougher, especially if you're not someone who can really kind of get in the headspace. So a lot of those actors are very talented and can get into the headspace pretty well. But if you're just having an off day, or maybe you're one of those actors that like you're a great actor but you can't get into that particular sci-fi headspace, you're gonna really struggle if you don't have props around to help you out. And we saw that with our actors on set. Is some of them really struggled with that. Push this box here and pretend there's a box there that we're gonna CGI in, and that's your button. But there was no box there, so it was sort of hit or miss.
Did you watch any of the behind the scenes of The Mandalorian?
I have not yet.
Okay.
It's on my bucket list.
There is one of the final episodes where Filoni and Favreau talk about what they're doing with like the new generation,
Mm-hmm.
and they talked about it. They're like, well, they put like a puppet in front of like a TV screen and record the puppet to see what the TV screen background would give.
Mm-hmm.
And they shot, I think, almost all of The Mandalorian in an enclosed dome.
Mm-hmm.
And what they had was on the walls. They already had pre-programmed for every time the camera moved, the background would move. But they actually had like the background like be the actual area around them. So when they're in the desert, they went out and like already had done the shots of the desert.
Mm-hmm.
But every time the camera moved, it would like move with it, so it looked like they were on set. So it'd be less editing and less CGI for the background.
Yeah.
Is that something that you see catching on in the future with?
I could totally see that expanding.
So you think we're going to move away from green screen and blue screen a lot to go that direction?
I could totally see that happening. I mean, it's so innovative, it's cost efficient, and it's just overall more effective, I would say. And one of the cool things, I mean, Mandalorian, so if we're talking about Star Wars content, where we started, The Mandalorian was really praised for sort of going back towards the roots of Star Wars. Like the targeting computers, it's the old school 80s targeting computers. They have the props there. They're doing new things like this to try and like make the actors really feel part of the world, which is something Star Wars had kind of gotten away from. And so, yeah, I think we're, especially like with its success, like because it's not just getting, financial success. I mean, well, audience success. It also had financial success. I mean, Baby Yoda's everywhere. So, yeah, I think we'll totally see more people trying to use these features.
What's the next now? I wish that we would get some behind the scenes of Avatar 2 and 3 coming out right now because I would love to see what James Cameron is doing behind the scenes.
I tell you,
Listen,
someday.
they're pushing it back another year, but you know what? As a fan of Avatar,
Yeah.
I'm fine with it. Push it back 2 more years, get it right. I'll still be alive.
My big philosophy has always been like I'd rather a company push something back. I know you're not a Halo fan, but big news is so Halo Infinity, which we've waited 5 years for, has been pushed back to next year now. And some fans are upset over that. But my big thing is like I'd rather a company wait until something is done right, realizes the vision they wanted, and then release it, instead of releasing something that's like half done, either with the intent of just, well, we did our best with the time allotment we had, or we're going to fix it later. Especially because we're talking games that they usually have the fix it later mentality, this new live service.
Battlefront.
Oh gosh, Battlefront 2, yeah, 100%. So I really prefer like companies to take their time. Like I don't mind waiting another 6 months to a year or 2 years even if the product you give me is then worth my time and the best it could be. No problem with that.
How do you? Okay, let's switch over to the writing side a little bit because we on the 5-year celebration of Shield of Hope we did talk about writing a lot and specifically with you and how our differences in characters and character development and like how
we have very
how
different approaches to that
film and story. How do you because this is maybe we could go back and forth on this. I haven't wrote like novels kind of like you have. I've wrote more screenplays, but how do you get started crafting your work? Like, what's the first thing? Do you write like the ending first? Do you get the idea for the ending in your head? Do you go back to the beginning?
I usually don't know what my ending is going to be until I'm already working through. There's a description I once heard. I believe it was Stephen King talk about this, and he said his writing process is sort of like excavating a fossil. He knows where he's starting, but where he's going from then on is a mystery, and he only finds it out as he's writing. Now, mine is a mix between that fossil approach, but but I also have a bit of the skeleton. So it's more like, did you ever see the movie called The Fifth Element?
No. I haven't.
Okay, so it's this futuristic sci-fi with Bruce Willis. Rather interesting film, a lot of great quotable lines, but not like necessarily a top tier film. But in the beginning, there's this scene where they bring this character back to life, and they have like a section of her bone. It's like a hand, I believe, if I remember right. And they sort of reconstruct the whole body based on this bone and the DNA sequencing. And first they rebuild the skeleton, then they put the muscles over the skeleton, then they put the skin over the muscles. So they rebuild a human pretty much. And my process for it is kind of something like that. So I have maybe a rough skeletal structure where I'm starting. Like in my initial process, I maybe just have some cool character ideas, some world building. I tend to do a lot of world building, so often some of that. And then I start building out the skeletal structure, just kind of a rough, like, here's kind of the story I want to tell. No like maybe a few hard points, usually not a hard ending. Every once in a while, maybe I have an ending idea, but generally not. And then what I like to do is actually go into the story and start writing my way through it. And as I write, I find so many new ideas, new twists, or sometimes even the characters just lead me down the journey on their own. Like one of the ways I often like to describe my writing is I'm not so much creating the story as I'm letting the characters tell their story through me.
Now, I'm sure there's a difference in not only like our styles of writing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we're very different.
Because I write shorter films,
mm-hmm.
and you like to draw out the whole story and like to expand.
I like to spend time with them more, yeah.
Whatever. So, do you feel like it's harder to write a longer book, or do you feel like it's harder to compress?
So for me, it's harder to write something short. You're probably the opposite, I imagine.
I am the opposite.
Yeah, I think it's harder because I have so much more I want to tell, so much more world building, and that's one of the things. It's often a lot easier to do with a story because I can get inside my character's head in like a way you can't. I can get inside their head. I can talk about the world more. I can explore elements that you have to be a little more strict about because of screen time and budget and also just, working with the actors. But the possibilities are limitless. And I could go on and on. And of course, the hard thing is that you have to rein yourself back because if you go on and on, your story gets lost among all the other content. Think of, you've probably never, did you watch the Witcher series on Netflix?
I have.
So if you ever read their books, it's very, Tolkien-esque in that there's just a lot of information in them, which they're enjoyable books, but sometimes it's a chapter where it's, like 6 to 8 pages, just the kings talking politics, and you're like, all right, everything I needed to get from this meeting, I could have had in 1 page. And that extra 5 pages, you're just like, why? And some fans love that. But for the average person, that you get kind of lose the story in that, and you might drop off. So that's a balance you need to find.
Well, it's weird, too, because you mentioned The Witcher, and I don't know if I called you. I think I called Mike when I was watching The Witcher series. I was only on episode 3, and, of course, I paused it, and I was calling him. I was like, so, tell me something here. I was like, how do you know that somebody's a Witcher? I was like, because I want to know. I don't know much of the background information, because so far, the only character I saw, and Mike's like, well, he has white hair. I was like, okay.
The eyes are another trigger,
I was like,
too.
I've seen that. But then the eyes, but they don't all go soulless black eyes. It's like I think they're more like a yellow, if I believe.
They kind of vary sometimes.
They glowed and stuff like that.
They kind of depend at different times of day and like what's going on. They have Witchers are kind of known for taking these ones sort of like it's a pre-battle potion almost, and it gives them like a bloodlust, and their eyes change during that.
It's weird because I'm looking around. I know it's like mythology slash different time periods in history and stuff like that, but I'm looking around. I was like, okay, Mike, I need like better descriptions because everybody's eyes is like kind of weird in this series. He's like, well, it's the characters that look more out of place. I was like, Mike, they all look out of place.
It's true because you're not very familiar with those genres either. So the fantasy genre is just way out there for you.
I like the series on Netflix, but I had no like background leading into this. I was just watching and I was like, as obviously. I shouldn't be asking questions in episode 3 when there's 10 episodes. Watch the whole thing through.
Especially,
but I want to know a little bit of background.
That's totally understandable. One of the things is the Netflix series. I think it's really neat, kind of how they aired those episodes because they're not in order. As you don't notice for the first 3-4 episodes, but as you get to episode 5-6, you realize, wait a second, this already happened. I saw that happen, and you start to realize, oh, this isn't in order. And so it becomes a little bit of an adventure for the viewer because you have to piece together the puzzle, which then comes up to the ending, which is finally in line. But yeah, no, that's part of the fun part. So you said you wanted about the Witchers. That's kind of how like these series draw you in. They present this mystery, and you have to keep watching to learn more. So I can tell you this. So season 2, you're gonna learn a lot more about Witchers because that's where book 2 has a lot more information. We're actually gonna meet some other Witchers. Is where it's going.
Was that based off book 1?
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity. Okay.
Yeah. The books kind of go in a weird order as well. But that one roughly follows the first book. Well, the first book you should read if you're going in order, because the author kind of skips around and they're sort of all over the place in the actual release dates.
Somebody like me that doesn't actually like read a lot of books and graphic novels,
Mm-hmm.
but loves to write, I don't get it.
Well, so you fell in love with the storytelling from film. So I don't think it's actually that much of a surprise.
Yeah, but I grew up like fifth grade and sixth grade, and like even in the seventh grade, I still have the books I wrote at home as a kid. Now, granted, they suck, but you know they were like good 10, 15 pages. Like I was still writing stories back then, but I never read a lot of books. Like I'm starting to read more stuff, mostly history, because that's what I like to do more than anything else. History has always been like, okay, if it's historical, I'll read it. But like fiction work, sitting down, it's always been a little bit rough. Also, you know what's been rough? Character names. How in the world do you pick out your character names? Because even mine, I struggle with.
That's a question I get a lot of the time, and I almost sometimes wonder, like, I think some people just have a knack for character names and some people don't, because literally, so my process for, like, naming a character, and I do fantasy names, so there's some pretty weird names. We got, like, Descar and Montalone and all sorts of, arias and things like that, which are just not names you can, Google 50 common names and just pull something from the list.
Do you I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No problem.
Keep that thought in your head. Do you, by chance, like, not only Google names, like, okay, what are some weird, like, popular names, but do you Google definitions to find names at all? Because
so I did that kind of
back from the George Lucas School of Hard Knocks. He did that quite a bit.
So I did that a bit in the beginning, and I started to notice something just as I was reading more, and also as I was kind of going into my writing. And so a lot of, especially for fantasy, and a lot of especially newer fantasy writers, they take names from Latin words, and this, when I say names here, I don't just mean character names. I also mean place names. That's a big thing. Place names and, yeah. I mean, that's huge. Sometimes item names as well. But, like, place names especially, they take from Latin words.
Regime names, any kind of name, yeah.
And I got to thinking about that, and I was like, so, to someone who doesn't know Latin, this seems really cool. And then you find the backstory, and you think that's really cool as well. But let's say you're someone who does know Latin, who studied that in school. You're going to catch these words right away, and it's going to get really repetitive when all these people are just naming things after this. Like, especially when they don't have Latin as a language in the world. I mean, it kind of almost implies that they do if you recognize it. And so I started to get away from that just because I realized how common of a theme it was. And while it seems cool when you're first starting out, there's better ways to go about that. You can create words that have meaning. Like one of my favorite things you'll see is sometimes they'll have words, but they'll use elements of the language they've already established in their book. So maybe they have certain phrases or sayings, and they'll work that in. So it still follows the naming processes we have in our world. You name a river, like Big Mouth River or something like that. But it's using their own words in the book instead of just taking the Latin. And so it creates this extra depth to the world versus just using Latin or any other language. Because sometimes other ones will get used as well. You'll see like French and German. Sometimes they'll pull ones from there. Sometimes Polish, Russian. You never know.
Why is Latin the go-to?
So I think Latin's got this air of mystery around it. We think of like, ancient Rome and things like that. And it's just got this sense of like old greatness. And it's not one, like it's a dead, non-spoken language. So it's not like French or German where if someone is French or German and reads this, they see this other word and get confused. It's no one's speaking Latin, and very few people read it anymore. So I'd say it's a combination of that. Not many people know it. It has this element of mystery, and it's also sort of a revered language. Because when we think of like those periods, we think, oh yeah, the greats, Greece, Roman, these great pieces of literature come out of there. These great stories, and it's almost like a callback to that element. But again, I think it gets oversaturated.
Knowing you as I do, you like medieval, medieval time periods, sci-fi, and I would even put you, I would say animation.
Yeah. Oh, I love animated stuff. And I would also break down the, so you say medieval. I'd actually split that in a couple categories. I would do fantasy, because I do, so what I'm most known for, my longest work I've done is, I classify as a medieval fantasy. But there's a difference there between, say, like a high fantasy. So there's different genres of fantasy, dark fantasy, things like that. My medieval fantasy is more closely related to like our medieval world. Compared to say The Witcher, which has a lot of, mythical monsters and creatures like that. I don't have that in mind. I don't have magic and spells. There's hints of it, but that's also in the Dark Ages they thought they had that. They would believe that they had these creatures. So, a couple different genres. Now, mind you, I love all of those genres. So I'm not saying just because I write in this one, it doesn't mean I don't like those. I adore those genres. That's probably where I started. I mean, the dragon is my favorite animal.
Somebody handed you out a contract like Benioff and D.B. Weiss got, okay, whether it's for Game of Thrones or whatever they were supposed to get from Netflix and Star Wars, What piece would you want to focus on? Would you be medieval? Would you be animated? Would you be sci-fi?
So that's a good question. I mean, animated can apply to any of those too. We've talked before in the show about Love, Death, and Robots, which has some very interesting, and I've recently found out some of the stories for that were inspired by short stories from sci-fi, like recent publishings. But if I was given a contract like that, that's a good question. I mean, it would...
Well, it all depends. What are you more passionate about? Are you more passionate about them?
Well, so I have passion for a lot of them, and sometimes it varies a bit.
Well, dang it, Jake, you can't choose one.
Well, so those are kind of my three. Now, if I had to pick one, though, there's a good chance I would go with the fantasy genre because it's what I'm most familiar with. I could still go the other routes. Actually, one of the ones I've had a lot of fun working with in the past couple of years is post-apocalyptic genres, which is just, they're very fascinating, like sort of a Mad Max, because you can really kind of explore the human psyche in it and how like people snap under pressure and the chaos and what it's like when the world doesn't have an order system like we have. So that's another fun genre.
I hope you're taking notes on the year 2020.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. So a lot of these like predicted like, oh, imagine this happening and this kind of chaos would break loose, and people are like, oh, that's so far-fetched. That's just fiction. And then now we see some of this chaos breaking loose, and they're like, wow, these people got it right. These writers were like on point.
See, I feel like it's been the opposite way from the stuff I've watched. Like, how it breaks down in like an unchaotic fashion or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the chaos they were predicting is the different chaos than what we've got.
I mean, we've been getting sort of a weird
it's
chaos.
Not like you think it would crumble down. It's a different...
We have had some weird chaos, but where it seems to be going...
It all goes to the same area, the disaster, but we branched off somewhere along the line down there than what the normal sci-fi / post-apocalyptic...
Yeah, the sci-fi likes to go the like AI route is one of their favorite ones. Your Skynet blowing us all up with nukes, which obviously we don't have AI like that. I think we're too aware of that genre. I think the ones that are more on point with things are the ones that look at like social unrest causing an apocalypse. Sort of just a breakdown of society rather than a nuclear wasteland. Mm-hmm. Though between you and me, I think the nuclear wasteland makes for some fantastic stories.
I think so too. But like it's weird though because like, and I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you break it down, like normal, like how you said, you cut like with the social unrest, especially like these post-apocalyptic sci-fi films, it kind of breaks down, like from all the films I've seen, it breaks down to like groups forming.
Yep. Well, so humans are social creatures, just from a purely psychological level. Like we like to form groups, but also the groups add an extra element of not just like comfort and like, oh, I feel good around these people, I feel more fulfilled. There's also a core safety element. So even if you're a more isolated person, if you're working with a group of people, it makes you more safe. You can do more work, you can accomplish more tasks. And so that's why, they form these groups, but it also makes sense that they form these groups.
But forming different groups, like we all agree with that area about how they like to portray in the sci-fi films. But I feel like if this becomes a sci-fi year, like 2020, post-apocalyptic, whatever, say the world is going to end for some odd reason, which, fun fact, an asteroid is supposed to come to Earth the day before the election this year, but that's besides the point. Asteroid 2020.
I don't think yeah. No. You heard it here, folks. We're predicting the apocalypse right now.
No, but it's weird, though, because it seems like it's split into two sides. It doesn't feel like there's, like, little groups within that. It seems like it's, like, going to split to those two sides, and then something's going to happen, and then we might split off farther.
So, sometimes that's often how it goes. You have that initial, like, groups, smaller groups are united against a common enemy, a common... and when I say enemy, that might not just necessarily be an enemy, like, oh, this figurehead here. It could be a concept or an idea, but they're united against this common goal. And while they're united, you don't see the differences between the groups. But once they overcome that goal and they no longer have this very powerful unifying factor, that's when these groups really start to, like, show themselves and splinter off. It'll start off as, like, small differences maybe between, two sort of powerful figures in it. But then it just progressively grows, and as it splits, it becomes easier for more groups to split off. And so that's where you see like the groups are there, but it's just they're harder to see them right now because they're all unified towards a common goal.
I feel like there should be more films like that besides like the smaller split off films.
Well, I mean, so the split off's usually like a post after the event itself, but I mean, because I think one of the reasons.
Is it more interesting? Because I don't feel like that would be more interesting. I feel like the actual like what leads to the small groups for me is more interesting.
I don't know. I mean, I think
that's one of the things. Like, I'm actually looking forward to the prequel Hunger Game books.
Mm-hmm.
You know, well, when she goes back and she's writing the prequels, but Lionsgate's going to have the rights to the film.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm more interested in that because of how the breakdown started.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I like about the post element is because then it opens the speculation for what happened. And when you don't know what happened, you can come up with a lot of different theories. So I told you I did a little bit of work with some post-apocalyptic stories, just a couple short stories. And I'm working on a novella for them. And what I'm planning to do is kind of link them all together and maybe have like a mini novel, but it's just a collection of stories and leading up to this big novella. And one of the things I'm very careful to do as I write this piece is I don't reveal what caused the world to be quote-unquote broken. There's a lot of references to, before the world was broken or so-and-so, different sayings like that. But I'm very careful to not say what actually happened, though I'll drop hints to potential different causes it could have been. So the reason, though, I don't say what it is because if you come right out and say, oh, yeah, there was a nuclear apocalypse, you remove a lot of speculation over what could have caused it. And I don't want to, and another thing is I also want to keep it realistic, and that's, let's say, like most of them, they go with nuclear apocalypse. I mean, Mad Max is one of the most iconic, but think of maybe like Fallout if you want to look at games and they have some stories around them. Nuclear apocalypse is so common and so overused. And I like to have something where, and it's kind of at a point where we're like, yeah, a nuclear apocalypse maybe could happen, but it's so unlikely. Like, it almost gets an element of just, it's not believable. And when you keep it vague, I mean, it allows fans to speculate and, really go through the details of the story to find these different pieces and come up with fan theories. I love seeing fan theories for things. And so, I mean, that's why I'm, really careful not to kind of say that. Because I want to offer details, towards a solution, but I want to let fans fill in some of that so that they can have a part of this world. So they can invest themselves in the story and the characters in a way you otherwise can't.
Now I'm just playing devil's advocate for most part of this.
Go for it.
But when it comes down, again, we're having the good conversation here back and forth whether you want to see what's before or after.
Mm-hmm.
To me, growing up, especially in Star Wars,
mm-hmm.
I had to watch 4, 5, and 6 first before I watched 1, and then when I was still getting into Star Wars, 2 came out in theaters. I didn't get a chance to see it in theaters, but I saw 3 with my dad in theaters.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my childhood, but I never really, even watching the originals, it wasn't ever oh, well, what happened before Luke? That's where my mind went. My mind always went after Return of the Jedi, well, what happened?
Interesting. So a lot of people...
That's why I'm more disappointed with the new trilogy, because I always, as a kid, I read the Star Wars lore that happened after Luke. You had all the fans in the expanded universe and all this other stuff that came out.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm one of those people that picture doing a sci-fi film. How you're talking about how you leave it open before what happened and you don't speculate?
I don't mind going before, though. I should say that. Because I mentioned this couple short stories. One of the planned short stories actually does take place before it happens. It actually leads up to when it happens. But again, dropping more details.
But picture you leaving the audience out in the dark about what happens at the end. How does it get resolved? I think would be a very fascinating thing, but that's all I want to add.
Yeah, so you have to be very careful. So this is a very common thing in the fantasy genre, especially. So fantasy is known for doing long epics, pretty much. There's going to be, let's say a minimal 3-4 books in a series, and so they have a lot of build up across these 3-4 books, a lot of build up, and I think one of the most iconic ones that gets referenced here is, are you familiar with the Inheritance cycle, the Aragon series?
No. They
had one movie. It was horrible. The movie was so garbage. The
Saphira was,
yeah. It was probably in that ballpark, not gonna lie. It's pretty bad because it doesn't follow the book at all. Though Saphira's information's pretty on point. But so this series, and I'm speaking about exclusively the books here. We're gonna just pretend the movie doesn't exist, as most fans do. And there's a lot of build up, a lot of suspense, kind of working through 1, 2, and 3. And so he's a very young writer when he does this. So there's some issues for sure. He's trying to kind of mimic Tolkien. So there's some sections. I know there's one chapter where I'm pretty sure it's maybe 6 pages or something where he's just forging a sword in high detail, and I was like, no one wants this. But so there's all this build up to facing the king. And the king is the ultimate enemy and facing his army. And the king has a gigantic dragon. So it's like, how are we going to beat this guy who has all of this magic, all of this power? And so Christopher Paolini, the author, kind of writes himself into a corner. And I'm sure you've heard the references to Tolkien and the Eagles. It's something sort of like that. And he has to kind of throw in this sort of cheap thing to get the character back on the playing field because he's just built up this enemy, this end game, to be so over the top and so much tension that he can't actually find a good solution to it. And in the end, when they actually fight, the fight is so lame. It's so much of a letdown compared to all we've been waiting for. And so that's one of the things you have to be like really careful with end games like that, is you have to either pull it off or you don't. Which, I mean, yeah, obviously it would be that, but it's really tough to pull off a good ending when you've really built up that hype.
And that plays a lot into like our discussions on Endgame and Infinity Wars. Mm-hmm. I mean, even the build up with past.
We talked about Infinity Wars build up was it was their Endgame as far as bringing the characters together, and it was fantastic and it was excellent build up. But then Endgame itself, which was the Endgame, wasn't able to match that hype.
But it was still, we both agree, it was still a good way to close
They did it pretty good, yeah.
No, I mean, we're not talking.
I wouldn't call them a failure by no means. No, not at all.
Debate comes. Do you care more about it being your project, or do you care more about the money or the fans at some point?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think that's where, especially the higher up you get on the radar of Hollywood and up there on like the top tier of the box offices,
mm-hmm.
you know, you wonder where you have to gain a little bit, sell a little bit.
I think there's always, so in everything, whether you're writing, you know, films, you're writing games, or you're writing stories, one of the best lessons you can take away is like the moment you start writing just for the money is the moment your quality is never going to reach what it once was. Mm-hmm. When you stop writing out of passion because you care about the story, because you care about the characters, because you want to learn more about these characters, because as you write, you learn more about these characters just as the readers do. The moment that doesn't matter and money is your top priority, you've already peaked. You're on your way down unless you find your passion again. So before we move on any further, let me turn that question back on you, Donnie. So you asked me about how I go about creating my stories, where my thought process is. What is your thought process?
I'm somebody that actually likes to write the ending first.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's typical, but what I like to do is typically I'll get the idea in my head, whether it's from, because I do watch a lot of news, whether it's something that I get from like a history that somebody says something that's historical, or whether it's somebody that when I listen to all these other podcasts, somebody says, oh, well, this happened to me. And I'm like, boy, that'd be cool if you added that in a sci-fi realm or a historical realm or something
mm-hmm.
like that. Just add things. But normally I'll come up with the ending first. I've done that for about, I did it for Fight For Me. I came up with the ending first. Although the ending switched, though. That's the interesting part, which I'll get into.
Mm-hmm.
With the sci-fi film that we never really finished, the ending got written first. I knew right where I wanted it. Agendas, the ending was written first. So there's all these different films that the endings are written first for me. But again, my struggle is the middle section,
mm-hmm.
especially for scripts.
Connecting the beginning to the end.
I can know where I want to start the characters,
mm-hmm.
and I know where the characters need to end. It's that middle section. And not too often does it change the ending,
mm-hmm.
but it has changed the ending, like Fight For Me, like because we felt, and we talked about this on the last podcast episode for the 5th year of Shield of Hope, but it felt the more I wrote the story, the more I was like, it's not that we need a redeeming moment for the character, but we need a moment for him to sit back and realize, as soon as he comes back to like reality, that, man, I wasn't doing the things I needed to do, where it was, he didn't obviously love his significant other enough, but he put other priorities first other than the things that should have been priorities.
So I think what you've kind of just said there kind of answers this next question, but I was going to ask, so do you ever feel like, since you have the ending, you have the beginning, as you're writing out the middle, do you ever feel like your characters are being, like you're pulling your characters too much towards the ending, rather than the characters are progressing towards the ending you were hoping for? And I think you kind of answered that there in saying that as you were going there, it didn't feel like it was going towards the ending you initially expected, and so you ended up changing it. But do you find that's a common issue as you work?
I would say it's a very common issue. I would say there's moments too in everybody's, and I would assume even in your writings, that there's moments, whether it's just even like a line that might be out of place or something like that we have to pull the character in one direction or another.
You have to be very careful.
It might feel out of place, but it does happen every now and then, just because it's like, there's something in your head that tells you that the characters still need to be here or there, whether or not
mm-hmm.
that the character decided to go one way. Maybe say you wrote a novel and the character splits off left, okay, but you know it needs to go right, so maybe you add another arc and have the character, like, there's like a point on the timeline where he shifts back towards middle. Or it could be he goes right and then shifts back towards left. You know, I feel like there's different areas there. But for me, yeah, I would say
A lot of that comes down to writing style too, because sometimes I'll find what happens is I'll find my ending. Like sometimes I'll have like a rough ending idea on my own, but I'll be writing my story and I'll find an ending before I was expecting the ending. And there's sometimes like, because of the way I write, since I don't necessarily know the ending, I usually have like a rough idea where we're going, but I don't necessarily know. I have these moments, and honestly, they always feel really good. And they often really frustrate the fans because they're usually like a sudden ending, and people are like, "But what happens next?" And I'm like, "You have to wait to find out, or you have to speculate based on clues." But where I'll be writing, and I'll like finish typing out a couple lines, and I'll just kind of look at it, and I'll be like, I don't feel like it needs any more. It just feels done, and you just know. I don't know if you get those moments where you're going, you're just like, "This is it right here. This is the ending."
Yeah, and I'll say with the sci-fi film, because that was one that we never finished, and God knows if we're ever going to go back and finish that one necessarily, because of A, budget, and B, just the cast and crew we need, and we don't,
Yeah, we're kind of small for that one.
It's hard to go back, but I will tell you, the original ending to that, which I'm not going to mention any like characters' names or anything like that, but this was my original ending, and because I look at everything through a cinematic lens, so between the whole sci-fi battle, whatever, that his significant other was down on the planet that they were on, and what I did was it was actually to get to the like say their space station or whatever, they had a different name for it, but say that it was their space station, they had like this long elevator that goes all the way
a sky
up,
lift, yeah,
all the way up into the atmosphere and stuff like that, and it was basically where the capital was up there, compared to like living on the Earth was actually like where like the peasants of the world live, and like the lower like class. And our main character is fighting the rebellion in the space station. He's able to look down at the on the ground where his significant other is, where he loves her or whatever, and they have that moment where they see each other, and then the line gets severed between them, like the elevators, they all get like smashed between them or whatever, and like you watch everything just like blow up underneath on the Earth, and like that connection between the character and stuff like that. So it's visual to me.
You two tend to think more, you think about a visual a lot, which I think, it's important to always think about visual where your characters are in the scene. One of the other things I notice is you often think, not from a character perspective, but you think from like a theme or moral, or what do I want this story to tell? And I think that's one of the areas, again, we talked about are two different. So you do shorter stories, I like to do longer stories. And I think that's another area where, since you think that way, shorter stories are easier for you, because that's generally what you do with a shorter story. It's easier. You kind of focus on the one theme and follow it and have this moral at the end. Meanwhile, the longer stories, you're going to have a lot of morals. It's more of a web compared to a whip.
Oh, 100%. Because when it came down to agendas, and this isn't like picking fun at anybody, but I got laughed at for my reasoning for agendas. Because the theme behind agendas, obviously, I'm a big theme person. When you have Max Jones' character in agendas, and maybe you guys can laugh too at this, but Max Jones' character was like, obviously he's younger than what Jimmy's character was, and Max's character was trying to find, I call it like a coming of age story, because Max's character younger, trying to get into this underground system that he thinks is going to be better living for him, and he's trying to change with the world, and multiple times we have like the pastor say it like throughout the whole film and stuff like that, when they're having like dialogue and it's going through his head and he's thinking about whether he wants to do this or not, and it talk about not conforming to the world. And I think too many of our generation conforms to the world. So when he died in the end of Agenda, spoiler, but it's been out for a year now, so you should have seen it or not. But when he died in the hands of Jimmy, and at the end in the hands of his partner, it shows that he didn't conform to the world. And I actually applaud that, because he would have made the wrong decision by conforming to the world. And I told Jimmy and Max's story, and they just laughed at me. They're like, how could you come up with that? But I was like, you know what? That theme is relevant in today.
That's the story you wanted to tell, is, stand up for, what you feel is right instead of conforming. Yeah, you always were very sort of tele-theme based. That's Donnie's thing. He also likes dealing in absolutes.
Yes, absolutes are key, although, no, they're still key.
Yeah, they're your thing. They're definitely, you're very used to.
You're either right or you're wrong. If you're in the middle, I always use, and don't want to get biblical here, but I always use the scripture where God tells you you'd rather be warm or I'd rather have you warm or cold than lukewarm because they'll spit you out.
And I always quote Obi-Wan Kenobi in response and say, only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Dude, I mean, I love Obi-Wan Kenobi, but he's not Jesus.
I don't know. I mean,
he looks like.
Have you ever
it.
seen the meme
Yes.
where my grandmother had this picture on the mantle and it's a picture of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and she's like, "Yeah, this is Jesus."
I was about to reference that.
We need to put that on screen for a moment for the viewers.
Yeah, we'll do that.
So that'll be here in a second.
New graphic coming right up. But no, I mean.
Here's the question we can leave the audience with: is Obi-Wan Jesus? Yes or no?
No, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And Jake, thanks for sitting down here and spending the time to do this podcast.
I mean, you're here in my bunker, so
yeah, you're
you
right.
came to
I
me.
Came here.
He showed up, and I was like, "Oh gosh, he's out there again."
First time we've done a Shield of Hope podcast where I've actually had to go to somebody. Maybe next time we'll be.
Well, you've come here before.
Maybe we'll go to California. Yeah, but not for Shield of Hope. That's been for real deal.
Oh, I thought we were for real. I always just assume we're for real deal since that's sort of where I operate the most.
We need to figure out that. But I mean, we're gonna have more conversations on the Shield of Hope channel and picking our brains along with. Learning what you guys want to, and like hopefully we inspired some of you guys today. Hopefully you guys didn't get too lost in some of our conversations. I know we threw out a lot of information, and boy, we actually had a lot of like character names and different different backgrounds.
Oh, to answer your question from earlier, since I never actually did because we got off topic. So how do I come up with my character names? So I sit back in my chair and I kind of close my eyes and I just think for a little while. And I think, so what kind of character is this? What do I want you to take away from the name itself? And then I just come up with names. It's that simple. I just think of names.
Yeah, I can't do that for some reason. I'm over here like trying to use like either the Latins or the Germans of the world and stuff like that, trying to figure out like meanings because I like my names have meanings.
What I do is I'll do meanings through sounds. So like a rougher name might be a rougher character. Not always. Sometimes I like to kind of turn that trope around. Something I'll also do sometimes is I'll pick out a key on my keyboard. I'll look down at the my laptop keyboard, and I'll pick out a letter, let's say like R or something, and I'll be like, all right, let's come up with something just that starts with an R. And that's more of a side character thing, but sometimes you come up with some really cool names, just kind of playing around, like, let's look at it. Rignit.
Rignit. Can you spell that right now?
Let's see, so, R-I-G, let's just N-E-T, very simple. I probably modified, maybe I'd add an extra E to an N to make it look more medieval, but Rignit.
I like it.
There you go. Name right on the spot.
Somebody a name. There you go. Somebody that listens to this podcast need a name for their character.
Someone write a story using that as the main character and link it to us in the comments. We'll give it a read.